Hello, this is Ariadne Rainbird, and today I'm recording this on the first day of Saturnalia, the 17th of December. So Saturnalia is a Roman festival which began as a one-day festival held on the 17th of December in the Julian calendar in honour of the Titan god Saturn, and was then, during the reign of Augustus, expanded to a three-day festival, with day 3 being the Opalia, the festival of Ops, the wife of Saturn, and the Roman equivalent of the Greek Titaness goddess Rhea. Day 3 was also a day of gift-giving. Saturnalia was later expanded to become a 7-day festival by the 1st century BCE, lasting from the 17th of December to the 23rd of December, and in the later Roman Empire, from the 3rd century CE, established by the Emperor Aurelian, was followed by Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the invincible sun. We don't know exactly when Saturnalia was first celebrated, but the 1st century BCE Roman writer Livy connects it to the dedication of the Temple of Saturn, which was around 497 BCE. The festival began with sacrifices at the Temple of Saturn in the Forum. The statue of Saturnus in the temple was said to have been hollow and filled with olive oil, representing Saturnus's abundance and links with agriculture. The feet of the statue were bound with wool generally, but were unbound during the festival, symbolising freedom. At the end of the rituals at the temple, the priests would dismiss the crowds with shouts of "Io Saturnalia," which would signal that it was time for festivities to begin. Homes were decorated with greenery, with garlands of ivy and evergreen branches being hung over doors and windows and over stairs. Whole trees, however, were not brought into the home, but evergreen trees growing outdoors were decorated outside, with sun symbols, stars and faces of the god Janus. Items of food, sweets and cakes were also decorated, with cakes being gilded and made in a variety of shapes, including animal shapes and fertility symbols, and these were also hung in the trees. Coins may also have been hung in the trees. People also dressed themselves up and often wore colourful costumes and greenery and sacred jewellery. Conical felt caps, called apilius, were also worn and symbolised freedom. These hats were traditionally worn by freed slaves, but at Saturnalia they were worn by everyone. Saturnalia was a joyous affair celebrated with a public feast, gift-giving and partying. Gifts were generally small token gifts, unlike the consumerism of modern Christmas celebrations, and were often small figurines made of wax or clay, and they were called sigillaria. Expensive gifts would mark social status, which was contrary to the spirit of the season, and so were generally not given. Children were also given toys as gifts. The 1st century CE poet Martial, however, in his poems, does describe both expensive and cheap gifts, including writing tablets, dice, knuckle bones, money boxes, combs, toothpicks, hats, lamps, balls, perfumes, pipes, a pig, a sausage, a parrot, tables, cups, spoons, clothing, statues and masks, books and pets. Martial suggests that token gifts of low value measure the high quality of a friendship. Patrons might give a gratuity or a sigillaricium to their poorer clients or dependents to help them buy gifts. Short poems sometimes accompanied the gifts, which were written out on paper or parchment, and these were much like greeting cards today. Martial himself wrote a number of poems to be attached to gifts. Sometimes joke gifts were given, and the poet Catullus reported receiving a book of bad poems by the worst poet of all time as a joke from a friend. Gifts were not only given on the day of the Sigillaria, but could continue in the last few days of Saturnalia. The festival had a carnival-type atmosphere where social norms were overturned. Things that were generally not allowed, such as gambling, were permitted, and on one day slaves were treated as free men with their masters serving them. Saturn was a god associated both with time and with agriculture, though the Roman historian Justinus makes him a historical king of the pre-Roman Italians. Justinus says that Saturnus is said to have been a man of such extraordinary justice that no one was a slave in his reign or had any private property, but all things were common to all and undivided as one estate for the use of everyone, in memory of which way of life it has been ordered that at the Saturnalia slaves should everywhere sit down with their masters at the entertainments, the rank of all being made equal. Sounds like a socialist paradise being looked back on and celebrated in a time of the Republic and then imperialism. Saturnalia was a festival of liberty and freedom and celebrated the mythical Golden Age which Saturn presided over. The festival would begin with sacrifices at the Temple of Saturn in the Forum. The Golden Age was seen as a time of peace and plenty, when the earth would yield fruit and vegetables without men having to work to produce them, when there were no wars and people lived in harmony with the earth and with the gods. Saturnalia is a time when we remember that mythical Golden Age and seek to restore it with a festival of joy and peace. This time of year being associated with peace on earth and goodwill to all is not something which is a sole property of Christianity, but was the theme of the Saturnalia festival long before the birth of Jesus. In a mystical sense, the Golden Age reflects the divine realm and the longing of our souls to reconnect with their divine origin, and the late Platonist philosopher Porphyry, 234 to 305 CE, referred to the festival with its associated emphasis on freedom as being symbolic of the freeing of the soul into immortality. The festival had a similar theme to the ancient Greek Chronia festival, though Chronia was held in the late summer. Chronos is the Greek equivalent of Saturn. Saturnalia adopted many of the features of the ancient Greek festivals following the Roman defeat by Carthage during the Second Punic War in the 3rd century BCE, when the Sibylline oracle was consulted, and they were advised to carry out the rituals and festivities in a more Greek manner. Traditional Roman rites were then replaced with Greek rites, including a public feast and the exclamation of "Io Saturnalia!" Io was a chant used to announce Roman triumphs, but originating in the rites of Dionysos or Bacchus, and is an exclamation particularly associated with this god. Although the rites of Saturnalia are dedicated to Saturn and Ops, they certainly have a bacchanalian feel to them, though Bacchanalia was a separate festival. Garlands of ivy and other greenery were also a feature of Saturnalia, which is also sacred to Bacchus, as was the consumption of wine, and it is possible that Bacchus would also have been worshipped during the festival, though we have no written records of this. Janus and Vesta, who were prayed to at the beginning of all Roman rituals, would also likely have featured in Saturnalia, particularly with Janus's association with Saturn, both being ancient gods associated with time. As the festival expanded from a single-day festival to a 7-day festival, it is also likely that other deities and festivals became incorporated into the Saturnalia. Epinalia, for example, the festival of the divine mare goddess, Epona, was celebrated on the 18th of December, the 2nd day of Saturnalia, though Epinalia was likely mostly celebrated by the cavalry and those who kept horses and donkeys, and was a day of rest for horses and donkeys, and it may not have been celebrated by the general public. Catullus, a Roman poet of the 1st century BCE, referred to Saturnalia as the best of days. A king of the Saturnalia was elected and crowned to preside over the festivities. This is reflected in later Western European culture during the Renaissance, where a lord of misrule presides over midwinter celebrations. Most of our information about Saturnalia comes from the 5th century CE Roman writer Macrobius's work of the same name, though earlier authors such as the 2nd century satirist and rhetorician Lucian also writes about it in his work Saturnalia, where he has Chronos himself proclaimed Saturnalia as a festive season, when it is lawful to be drunken and slaves have licence to revile their lords. Macrobius says that Saturnalia was a feast or a festival of light leading up to the winter solstice, and that many candles were lit, symbolising the quest for knowledge and truth. The light was then celebrated in the later Roman Empire as Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquerable sun. Saturnalia and Sol Invictus continued as popular festivals until the Christianisation of Rome under Constantine, though many of the features of Saturnalia were adopted into Christmas festivities. Saturn also had a darker side, and one of his myths involves him swallowing all his children before being overthrown by Jupiter, who had been hidden away as a baby by Ops, his mother. Saturnus had another consort called Lua, sometimes called Lua Saturni or Saturn's Lua, who was a goddess of destruction, sometimes named Mother Destruction. The weapons of enemies killed in war were burned in her honour. Saturnus also has a chthonic nature, connecting him to the underworld and its god, Dispater, who was also a god of hidden wealth. In some sources, Saturnus received dead gladiators as offerings, known as munera, during gladiatorial events during or near to the time of the Saturnalia. Later Christian writers connected this with human sacrifice and assumed that the primeval Saturn had demanded human victims, though there is no evidence for this. Macrobius says that Saturnus was placated with sacrificial victims consisting of men, virorum victimis, and Dispater was offered human heads. In myths concerning Hercules, during his 12 labours he visits Italy and insists that the practice of human sacrifice be stopped and the ritual reinterpreted, and that the Romans were to offer effigies or masks called ossula instead of heads to Dispater, and figurines to Saturn instead of human sacrifice. There is a mask in the representation of Saturnalia in the 4th century calendar of Philocalus. Candles were also offered to Saturn as a substitute for the light of life. Many Saturnalia customs have survived into modern times in Christmas traditions, including feasting, decorating trees, burning candles and giving gifts, as well as focusing on a time of peace and goodwill. Even the modern felt Santa hats are reminiscent of the pileus hats of Saturnalia. So I would like to wish you all a happy Saturnalia, Io Saturnalia. And if you have enjoyed this video, please do like it and subscribe to my channel. Io Saturnalia. Thanks for watching.